I love his house.
On January 20th, 1942, 15 men gathered in a private villa outside Berlin.
This meeting is not taking place.
They dined on the finest foods and wines.
Not bad for French.
And in a meeting that lasted 2 hours, they would change the world forever.
This is more than war. Must be a different word for this.
Every record of their meeting was destroyed.
Today, each of us becomes a bearer of secrets.
Except one.
The brief remains clear. All of Europe, no Jews, not one.
I am speaking!
Auschwitz, isolated and close to significant rail access.
Systematically annihilate all the Jews of Europe.
The Jews hold the bricks, and they build the buildings themselves.
The method is now defined.
Kenneth Branagh, Stanley Tucci.
Get them on the trains.
A secret meeting, a hidden document. Conspiracy. This is how it happened.
It was the most disturbing experience of my 20-year acting career. So said Kenneth Branagh of his role as Reinhard Heydrich, the man who chaired the Wannsee Conference, the subject of the 2001 film Conspiracy, which is our film club movie today. On the 20th of January 1942, 15 men met in a luxurious villa in a wealthy suburb on the outskirts of Berlin. Their task was to agree a way forward in what became the Holocaust, but what the participants described as the final solution to the Jewish question. Here are some of the opening remarks from Heydrich, as played by Branagh.
We have a storage problem in Germany with these Jews. And there have been conversations for almost a year now about this Jew and that Jew and the complexities of the law. And this problem, as you, I'm sure, know, has tormented us. As you know, we first undertook to expel them from all means by which our people would have to deal with them. Every sphere of life of our German people. The laws we enacted at Nuremberg, and we should all drink a toast to Dr. Stuckert for devising them.
Co-author, modestly, I am the co-author.
They established the fundamental legality for the creation of a Jew-free society, a Jew-free economy for the world to see, and we indeed have eliminated the Jew from our national life. Now, more than that, the Jew himself must be physically eradicated from our living space.
On the 82nd anniversary of that meeting, Roger Moorhouse, friend of the show and historian of Nazi Germany, joins me to discuss the history behind the movie, as well as the film itself. This episode is particularly important as here in the West we see a worrying rise in anti-Semitism. Now, the rather inferior trailer at the top of the show does make the movie sound like a Nazi version of Downton Abbey, but nothing could be further from the truth. Also starring Stanley Tucci, Colin Firth, David Threlfall and Barnaby Kay, as well as a bevy of other actors who'll look familiar, it grips from the start. Links to everything we discuss are in the show notes, and please do get in touch if you have any comments. Plenty more great history to come, including the War of 1812 and the Battle of New Orleans, Checkpoint Charlie, and our Great British Commanders series continues with Gordon and I chatting some of the also-rans after we settled on Haig and Slim for World War I and World War II respectively. Now listeners, I'd really appreciate it if you could give this little pod a 5-star rating on Spotify or Apple and share with friends. It means so much and it helps it grow. In the meantime, I'm going to hand you over to myself and Roger Moorhouse discussing the film Conspiracy. Great, Roger, welcome. It's great to have you on. This is your, you're actually a substitute guest for our film club.
Wow, thanks.
Yeah.
What an opening that is.
You're replacing Tim Hewitt, who's the film director, who's filming as we speak. But I've got a far better guest now.
That's better.
Yes. Roger Moorhouse, the distinguished, acclaimed historian of Nazi Germany. And that's going to be relevant for our discussion. And Roger, you should tell the listeners, you are also a medal holder from the Polish state, aren't you?
Yes, I've been awarded the Order of Merit of the Republic of Poland, 5th class. I'll have you know, 5th class. I received that a few years ago for my previous book, First to Fight, about the September campaign. So that's a lovely thing. It's a lovely thing to have your work honoured in that way. So
It is.
We
That's why I mentioned it.
we
Roger.
joke about it, but it is a lovely thing.
Oh yeah, I didn't mention it to make fun.
No,
of
I
you.
know. I joke about it,
Do you?
but
Right.
it is hanging in the loo, and it's a lovely thing.
Well, Roger, it's great to have you on. I know you also appear on the Battleground podcast.
Yes, as a sort of first reserve. Again, a bit like now, Ollie.
Always the bridesmaid.
Always the bridesmaid. Exactly.
So, and then we're going to be discussing today, we are talking about the film Conspiracy.
Indeed.
Starring Kenneth Branagh and Stanley Tucci. But really, it's all about the Wannsee conference, which was held. And if you're listening to this when it comes out, which is on the 20th of January, that's this Saturday, the 20th of January, that is the 82nd anniversary of the Wannsee conference, which was the meeting for the actual horrors of the Holocaust. The Holocaust is set in motion as a result of this meeting. Is that fair to say there, Roger?
That's the conventional interpretation, which I have to say is probably kind of wrong. The Holocaust is already happening in January 42, right? So what the Wannsee conference is, and this comes across really well in the film, what the Wannsee conference is kind of Heydrich, who is Himmler's deputy in the SS, basically saying to these various mandarins, most of them are senior civil servants within the various ministries, most of them, about 15 men in that room. And what Heydrich is calling them together to do is to basically say, this is what's going on, and I'm in charge of it. And all of the rest of you do not have a say. We're all complicit in what's going on. We all know what's going on. So none of you can claim not to have known. But at the same time, I'm in charge and you will answer to me. So he's established, we think of Nazi Germany in a way as a sort of perfect hierarchy almost, this idea of the Führer principle and Hitler at the top of a perfect kind of triangular hierarchy. And to some extent that is the case, but then to a large extent it also isn't. Hitler doesn't have his finger in every single pie. He's not on top of, he's a dilettante. He gets up at midday. He stays up late at night, watches movies in his own little world. So none of which is to say that he was ignorant of the Holocaust, of course, because it's absolutely central to what the Nazi project was. But it wasn't that sort of imagined perfect hierarchy. And if, when you think about how Nazi Germany operated, particularly with these various paladins, with Goering, with Himmler, with Heydrich and others, the best way to imagine it is not of a perfect hierarchy, is of rats fighting in a sack. I always think, there was so many tensions there. There were so many sort of competing interests. They were literally competing amongst themselves for influence, for Hitler's ear, for money, for competence. All of these things, and you can see that in the Wannsee conference. So all of that informs what the Wannsee conference is Heydrich basically saying, this is my fiefdom, right? You all know it's happening, so you can't, he's establishing general complicity. You all know it's going on because I'm telling you about it, but you all answer to me. This is my fiefdom. Don't mess it up, right? So that's what he's doing. So the idea of this being sort of a kickoff meeting for the Holocaust is kind of right, but kind of wrong at the same time. So it's both deeper and more mundane than that, if that makes sense.
And so was this a kind of, because I was thinking this, watching it again, Heydrich's he dominates that meeting. He's the chairperson, but he's also, there's no doubt, any doubt that there is he clears up very quickly. That he is in charge. Now, is this, I was thinking this whilst watching it, is this because Heydrich this is a kind of power grab for Heydrich, and the Holocaust is a way of him gaining power, in that if he successfully exterminates Jews, the Roma, homosexuals, the mentally infirm, etc., then he will be the sort of first among equals to take over one day. And so that's really why he's doing it. Or has he been asked by Himmler, look, we need to ramp this stuff up. You need to, because Himmler's his superior, I think.
Yeah.
you need to ramp this up. We need to exterminate all the Jews in Europe.
Yeah, to some extent that it is the latter. He's not necessarily sort of stamping his own position on it. He has been given that task. He was given that task by Goering, effectively, to sort of coordinate this operation. And it needed many, as you can imagine, anything of that scale needed the collaboration and cooperation of lots of ministries and lots of different bodies within the organization. So the SS couldn't do that alone. So, you know, the mass killing of the Holocaust is really going on from the previous summer of 1941 onwards. And that's that opening phase, which is expressed in this in Conspiracy very, very well. That opening phase is what's known as the Holocaust by bullets, which is where the Einsatzgruppen, these famous Einsatzgruppen, led by the SS, but generally, you know, what they tended to be were sort of reserve soldiers and reserve policemen, very often, you know, middle-aged, sort of pot-bellied, 40-year-old reserve policemen. So not really fit for frontline combat, but they were good for shooting civilians, basically. So they had this phase of mass shooting, basically. The most egregious example being Babi Yar outside Kiev, which came into the news last year, if you remember, after the Russians shelled the memorial site at Babi Yar just outside Kiev. And at Babi Yar, for example, which is the worst example, 33,000 people were killed over a couple of days in, I think it was late September of 1941. And this was that phase of just sort of rounding up Jews and taking them outside of town and shooting them into pits, basically. So it's a very kind of agricultural, it's very brutal method of killing. So this is already going on. And even the more sort of industrial killing process. So they're already looking, the Germans are looking at the end of 41 for different ways to carry out mass killing. And in Australia, this might sound strange, they're looking for more humane ways of carrying out mass killing. And that's humane for the killers, not for the killed. It's crucial to...
Yeah, this is mentioned by one of the characters in the drama. Rudolf Lang, is that a name?
Rudolf Langer was, you have to say Conspiracy is very close to the historical record. There are no characters there that were invented. They are all the characters that were at the conference. And Rudolf Langer was the head of the Sicherheitsdienst, so the security service of the SS. He had just participated and led this extermination operation in Estonia, in the Baltic. And Estonia, as they mention in the film and is mentioned in the Wannsee Protocol, Estonia was the only part of Europe that was already Jew-free, as the Nazis put it, Judenrein. Because Langer had done such a good job of exterminating the Jews of Estonia. So he was one of those that was at that sharp end of the Einsatzgruppen killings, right? And I thought his portrayal actually was really, really interesting because, you know, he chain smokes all the way through the whole thing, which is not that unusual, but I think that's used as a sort of shorthand for some degree of mental anguish. So he chain smokes throughout the whole thing. And there's one particular interjection where they're all talking in euphemisms about evacuation to the east is the favorite euphemism for, you know, what you're going to do to the Jews. And he stands up in this conference and he says, and I've just come back from Riga. He talks about Riga in Latvia as well. And just to be clear about what we're talking about, he says, I have been evacuating 30,000 Jews to the east by shooting. He says it's important that we understand what words mean. So he's kind of blowing away all of this sort of obfuscation and use of euphemism by just saying, just to be clear, is this what we're talking about? What I've been doing, mass shooting, is what you're talking about. You know, so just to clarify, and there's a wonderful, I mean, it happens a few times in it where, you know, they have a stenographer in the room who's writing everything down. And I think one of those moments is exactly then, where you see Stanley Tucci's character, who is Eichmann, who looks around at the stenographer and sort of shakes his head or wags his fingers, says, "Don't record that." No, so the record had to be clean. The record had to have the euphemism and not the truth of what was going on. So that was the opening phase, right? This mass progress of mass shooting, and they're already experimenting with other methods late in 41. So all of that is already going on by the time that this group meet early in 1942. So it's not as though this is like a kick-off meeting. This is where, this is what we're going to do and blah, blah, blah. It is relatively close to the beginning of the process, but that's already happening. So what Heydrich is doing is making sure that there's coordination between all of those offices of state, that they're all pulling in the same direction, that he's established his command over it, crucially. And that's because he was a very ambitious individual. I mean, like, as you said, your initial question. So it's a little bit of both. It is an ongoing process in which he has to sort of, create some sort of hierarchy, create a workable system. And at the same time, there's undeniable that he is personally ambitious and wants this to be sort of, his signature achievement in the Third Reich. But it's a huge thing. They're talking about, not just, as we now know, the 6 million of the Holocaust. They're talking about, killing all of the Jews of all of Europe. So there's this list within the Wannsee Protocol, and this is all referenced in the film as well, where you're talking about 11.5 million Jews, and they're talking about the Jews of Switzerland, the Jews of Sweden, the Jews of Ireland.
Yeah,
so the
mentions,
ambition is huge, is to actually cleanse, as they put it, cleanse all of Europe, even neutral Europe, and the areas of Europe unoccupied by the Germans. All of that was to be cleansed in this plan. So it's absolutely enormous.
The casting of it is Kenneth Branagh, who plays Heydrich. Because when you look at pictures of Heydrich, he has this kind of angular face.
Yes,
whereas
it's like a horse. I always think he's got a horse.
Yeah. It is a bit like that.
Yeah,
and but Branagh's a little bit more of a sort of. He's got a nice, friendly, pudgy sort of face. So it's, but. That kind of falls away, though. Those any thoughts of sort of friendliness fall away.
He's cold. He's very, very cold. It's I think it's a remarkable performance.
He won an Emmy for it, I think.
Brilliant. I mean, totally deserved. I mean, you're right. I mean, in terms of physiognomy and physically, he doesn't really look like Heydrich, as you say. He's quite sort of, dare I say, sort of chubby of countenance, but yeah, sort of friendly face, and he doesn't have at all that sort of horse face that Heydrich had. But once he gets going acting, doing that wonderful thing that he does, acting, he just seems to inhabit Heydrich. And there's this, how would we describe it? It's sort of a comradely coldness about him. So he can be all smiles, but it's quite a cold smile as well.
Yeah. The moment he's challenged, he's
absolutely
on it straight away.
Yeah. So he's very quick to sort of stamp down any threat to his authority, real or perceived, in that, and that comes across so well, and he does it so well as well, Branagh. In very short order, he establishes his absolute control over that room. It's a remarkable thing to see.
Yeah, the only time he really comes into a kind of a little bit of a bump in the road is dealing with I think his name is Kritzinger.
Kritzinger, yeah.
Yes, played brilliantly by David Threlfall.
Yeah, and Stuckert as well. So
Stuckert, yeah. I mean, Stuckert, Colin Firth. Yes, I think when William Stuckert, the author of the Nuremberg Laws, is trying to impose some kind of morality on a meeting like that, that this.
Yeah, well, I mean, we have to be a bit careful here. And this is where I think this is where Conspiracy, the film, strays from Wannsee Conference, the truth, the historical event, because I think it is in the record that Stuckert did protest. Now, he was the author of the Nuremberg Laws, as you said, in 1935. He was a legal man, first and foremost, and he was primarily concerned. He was in a state secretary in the Ministry of Interior, but he was primarily concerned with the writing of German law, the functioning of German law, and what he saw in those plans for evacuation to the east, in inverted commas, was a sort of a trampling over those legal principles that he'd rather painstakingly established. And particularly, one of the things that they obsessed about at the Wannsee Conference was the definitions of sort of liminal groups of Jews, like what they called Mischlinge, those of mixed race, and precisely what defined a Jew in those liminal cases, whether you were Jewish or not, and that obviously would decide your fate. Now, he'd already done that to a large extent in the Nuremberg laws. So what he was objecting to was a sort of a post facto and rather haphazard trampling upon the legal principles that he'd established. But it wasn't out of a sense of morality. And there's a wonderful scene there where he's challenged by, the one of the party representatives, Gerhard Klopfer, this rather porcine, very fat, in the brown uniform.
Yeah, and played by Ian McNeice.
Ian McNeice. I mean,
disgusting.
He is disgusting. He's utterly repellent character. And he basically accuses Stuckert of being a Jew lover. And he says, I hate the Jews just as much as you do. I just understand, I understand their genius. And I understand how devious they are. So it's an amazing scene where he's confronted and he responds with real anger. But he's not doing this out of love for the Jews. He's doing it because he understands how devious they are, and the legal case kind of for that reason has to be watertight, which he says it's not. So that scene is brilliant in the film, and the record tells us that Stuckert did object to this kind of rather haphazard sort of trampling over his legal principles. But the bit that isn't in the historical record is Kritzinger, interestingly. So I think Kritzinger doesn't really feature in the historical record. There's no mention of him really, apart from his participation. There's no mention of him contributing to the conference at all in the historical record. So he was a permanent secretary in the Reich Chancellery. So again, he's one of those a senior Mandarin, but in a different office sort of thing. And I think that to some extent his objections are invented for the sake of dramatic narrative. So they have these two characters that protest against what's going on in Kritzinger and Stuckert. Stuckert definitely yes, Kritzinger much less so. And I think, having read up a bit about this, I think that the reason they chose Kritzinger to play that role is partly because there was no record of him saying anything at all, crucially, but also after the war. He lived shortly, a couple of years after the war, died, I think, from memory, I think about 47. He did express some regrets for having participated in fact what had been done after the war. So perhaps they're just sort of projecting that backwards. But to some extent, his intervention is a dramatic invention for the sake of the film. But it kind of needed that because there was, with the exception of what Stuckert does, which is not out, as I said, is not out of sympathy or morality or love for the Jews or anything. With the exception of that, there is unanimity around that table as to what they're doing, and that would make for a fairly boring film. Yeah. So they had to create some, that you needed that degree of conflict, even if it had to be exaggerated and invented.
But what's interesting is it shows that even if you provide any kind of objection in that meeting, in Stickert's case,
yeah,
maybe slightly ego-driven as well, the fact that they're trampling over his work.
Yeah,
it does, because it's so horrific what they're discussing. You're looking as a viewer for someone show some kind of objection.
Yeah.
And even though Stuckert is doing it for, they're still deeply anti-Semitic and horrific reasons.
He's doing it for personal reasons and for legalistic reasons. Yeah. But he's still, absolutely anti-Semitic. He's still absolutely, on message as far as the Nazis were concerned. No, you're right, and it's almost an exercise in a way, or it's a demonstration of that great line from Hannah Arendt. She's talking about the Eichmann trial. It's the banality of evil, because to a large extent they're ordinary men. Look, there's 15 men in that room. They are all, with a couple of exceptions, but they're all highly educated. There are 8 doctorates in the room, for example. Mostly
including that Einsatzgruppen chap, Langer.
Yeah. So there's a wonderful scene from where Klopfer actually says this. He says, "Well, how many of us have studied law?" And sort of 8 of them put their hands up, and he goes, "Oh God, no, not more lawyers," but it's true. You know, this is the senior legal representatives of the Third Reich discussing the crime of the century. It's quite an astonishing scene. So yeah, but you're not hearing anyone really making any sort of objection. So there, and it's all discussed in to a large extent in the most sort of banal, sort of bureaucratic terms. So it's that.
But you wouldn't have got an objection anyway.
No,
though.
of course, no,
because
absolutely.
you would have been sent to Sachsenhausen or something.
Of course, yeah, and that's I mean that's an interesting point actually, which points up how we know about the Wannsee Conference at all. This is one character in this, Martin Luther, which is actually Martin Luther, but you know, a latter day Martin Luther, and not the Protestant reformer. He was a representative of the Foreign Office at the conference, of the German Foreign Office. So he was one of Ribbentrop's deputies, and they were all given a protocol, so i.e. the minutes of the meeting afterwards, and all of those other copies, all of the other 14 copies disappeared, either soon afterwards or at the end of the war, in the chaos of the end of the war. And only Luther's survived. So that's the only one that actually survived the war. And the reason it survived was that he himself crossed Ribbentrop at some point later in the war, 43, 44, I think, and actually found himself being sent very, you know, as you just suggested, he was sent to Sachsenhausen. So he lived out the end of the war. He died of a heart attack, I think, right at the end of the war, either just before or just after, you know, the liberation of the camp. And the reason that his copy of the protocol survived was that he wasn't around to dispose of it. It's as simple as that. So then that was discovered by the Americans in 47 as they were sort of going through the you know, the German archives and going through the, you know, the filing cabinets in the Foreign Office and so on, and they found this protocol of the Wannsee Conference. Were it not for that particular oversight on Luther's part, we wouldn't know about it. We wouldn't be having this conversation. There'd be no film. It's quite astonishing.
Amazing. And Stuckert, I was reading into this, and it might be a bit of conspiracy theory. Stuckert, I think, was killed in a car crash in 51. Yeah. But there is some suggestion that perhaps the Mossad went for him.
Yeah, I've heard that as well. I don't know what the proof is of that. It's quite possible, I suppose. He was very prominent in that, as we said, in drawing up the Nuremberg laws and creating that legal structure. This is another thing. I mean, I talk about this. I'm horribly self-promoting, but I'll mention my
please do
book, my recent book, The Forgers. But what comes across out of that, and it does here as well, is that, you know, I think we imagine the Holocaust almost as a sort of a frenzy of killing. And on one level it was, of course. You look at those Einsatzgruppen killings, of course, they are kind of frenzied. They are brutal. But crucially, everything that happened had to have a sort of legal structure around it. So there's this curiously legalistic nature of what the Third Reich is doing, even in its most brutal moments. So that, and you can see that in what Stuckert did, you know, creating the legal definition of what was a Jew, because crucially, you know, in Jewish culture and in Judaism, you know, there's a religious definition of who is a Jew, because it comes down the matrilineal line, right? So, so someone whose father is Jewish, for example, mother is not Jewish, then you're not Jewish as far as other Jews are concerned, and religiously not Jewish, and culturally not necessarily Jewish. So, but that's different from how the Nazis defined what was a Jew, right? So, you know, you could have a sort of secularized couple who were no longer observant, but both came from sort of full Jewish background. But to the Nazis, they are both Jews. I mean, even if you convert to Christianity, but they saw it in race terms, right? So that for that reason, you know, they had to have some sort of legal definition of what was a Jew, because the Jewish definition of what was a Jew didn't work for them because it wasn't by race. So that was why, in a way, that, you know, Stuckert had to do what he did at the Nuremberg laws. But again, you've got this sort of, the whole legal processes around, the isolation of the Jews up until 39, marginalization, you know, how they're sort of excluded from the various professions and so on, how they're excluded from wider society, and then even up to their deportations. You know, when you received your deportation notice, it had on the front page all the paragraphs of German law that the deportation was based on. So this was, as far as they were concerned, the recipients, This was a legal process. This was entirely legal, which is partly why the vast majority of those that received deportation notices went along with it. Turned up for their deportation, got on the trains, and went to their fate. So there's this sort of legalistic element around it. This sort of legal structure around it is actually really, really important. And Stuckert was the primary architect of all of that. So you can see why he would be someone who potentially, post-war might be targeted by people like Mossad. But whether truth of that, I have no insight on.
So there's an interesting scene where a character, Otto Hoffmann, who is seated next to Kritzinger.
That's the Kritzinger. Yeah.
Yes, and he is an SS Gruppenführer. I'm looking at the cast list here. Nicholas Wooderson plays him brilliantly, and he's SS Gruppenführer Otto Hoffmann. He's the chief of the SS Race and Settlement Main Office, so not disposed to any kind of sympathy for any of the Jewish people who are going to be slaughtered. But he has a kind of episode where he goes, he doesn't feel well, and it's round about the time they're talking about killing. Basically.
And then he manages to blame it on a bad cigar. Right?
Yeah, and he goes to the bathroom. He's consoled by his colleague Langer, actually.
Yeah. It's a difficult. I'm not sure I can shed any light on that because, as you say,
it's probably invented. But
I think it probably is, again, for dramatic purposes. There's no reason for someone, in the SS working in the Race and Resettlement Office. These are the people who are very much, they're the sharp end of what's going on. They're under no illusions as to what's going on, or indeed what they have in mind. So the idea that he would have a sort of sudden fit of scruples or a sudden, realization that this is the truth of what they're doing is slightly nonsensical.
Well, they're all eating before, during, after, and it's really well done because you see the beginning of the Wannsee. And I wanted to ask you about the actual location, but the Wannsee Villa itself. But the chefs, the kitchens produce these sort of, I'm sure, luxurious food, given it was during the Second World War and probably difficult to get hold of ingredients. But it's disgusting watching them eat, stuffing their faces with pork and pear roasted, and they're all drinking as well, and smoking non-stop. I mean, that's all a bit too much. You'd have struggled.
It sounds like an Aspects dinner.
Yeah, it does actually, doesn't it? Aspects of history dinner.
Just without the political opinions.
yes. Yeah.
But the house itself, it still stands. It's still there. If anyone listening, if you're going to Berlin, go and see it. It's a fabulous museum now, but the house is still in the same state that it was at the time to a large extent. I mean, it wasn't damaged during the war, for example. It was used post-war for various things. It was used as sort of a school and a sort of technical training college and things like that. And there's a couple of lines there where Heydrich in the film where he says, I want to make this my house. Apparently that was the case. He did want to, that he had it earmarked as his residence after the war. Of course, he didn't survive to see after the war. But it's an interesting place. It was. They mention it in the film. It had belonged to a Jewish industrialist who'd been disenfranchised and removed, and then was used at the time that this happened in 1942. It was used by the SS as kind of a high-end sort of guest house for visiting dignitaries, for visiting SS generals. For example, if you come to Berlin to have a conference with Himmler or whatever it might be, they might, if you're lucky, they might put you up in the Wannsee Villa. So in that sense, it's absolutely correct. So it had all those staff, would have been accustomed to having meetings like they had there. So, and it is a fascinating building and beautiful. I mean, the location right on the Wannsee Lake is stunning, and it's a very elegant part of Berlin, out to the southwestern suburbs. So it's a really beautiful place to go. And curiously, I've been there many times, and I was there once, this is going back a few years. And right next door to it is a beautiful beer hall, like a big beer garden, And I'd been working in the archive in there, and I went next door to have something to eat and a beer, and I was sitting in the sunshine. And the only sort of table left was to share one with this German couple who were sitting there. And I sort of said, "Do you mind if I sit down?" And they said, "Yeah, sure." I sat down, and they sort of we started talking, and they said, "Well, what, we were talking in German," and they said, "What have you been doing? What are you doing here?" Realizing I was foreign, and I said, "Oh, I've just been working in the Wannsee Villa next door. I've been researching in the Wannsee Villa." On the assumption, perhaps lazily, that everyone in Germany knew what the Wannsee Villa was. And they looked blankly at me. And I said, "Do you know where the Wannsee conference happened? Do you know the Holocaust?" And blank, nothing. They just, maybe I'm just assuming too much, but I found that quite surprising, that even when I explained it, they had no knowledge of the Wannsee conference whatsoever. I don't think it's that obscure, but anyway,
It's
I found that quite surprising.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because I mean, this film, whilst it's a TV film, I think it had quite a big impact at the time.
Yeah.
But there are two German versions and one that just came out last year.
Yeah, and there was an earlier German version as well.
Yeah,
one from the 80s, I think.
Yes, which I haven't seen actually. I should
No,
watch
I haven't
those.
either. I mean,
But
there was a phase of this. I mean, there was a great book came out. Mark Roseman wrote a book around the same time, around the millennium, I think it was. He was then, I think he still is. He was an academic at Southampton University, and he wrote a really good book on this. Very short. I do like short history books. I'll be honest. Called the Villa, the Lake, the Meeting. And it's just the story of the Wannsee conference, the participants, what they decided, what they didn't, the mythology around it. It's just a sort of really good, accessible account of all of this. And that came out around the same time. So there's quite a lot of, I think there's a decent amount of knowledge about Wannsee now, and the significance of it, and what it is and what it isn't, I think, crucially as well. As I said, it is slightly more complex than just imagining it as the kickoff meeting for the Holocaust. I mean, that works for shorthand, but it's a bit more complicated than that.
yeah, it's marketed or at least it was marketed in that way. I mean, it's interesting that it is so thrilling as a thriller. You are on the edge, but it's basically 15 men in a room just talking.
Yeah. I mean, it's a bit like 12 Angry Men in that sense. This is the thing. I know when we were talking before, and you have these various categories that you suggested of, best scene, for example. Well, the whole thing is almost one scene, right?
Yeah.
Because it is literally 15 men in a room, and then there's a couple of kind of breakout scenes, you could say, where like you mentioned, the Hoffman, I think it was, who goes to the bathroom, and there are various other little scenes that are sort of extraneous to that main thing, and it's pretty much an hour and a half of 15 men in a room. So it's almost this one scene in itself, it's not, which makes it difficult to answer that particular,
it does.
that particular category. But there's such tension is developed within that. I mean, I think it's a brilliant piece of filmmaking. It really is. And so often now, I think, I'm sounding like an old man, but so often now you see films where it's all about special effects. It's all about, set pieces, which can be brilliant very often, but always at the expense of sort of characterization of developing genuine human drama. And this has got characterization. It's got human drama in spades without any set pieces, without them ever leaving the room. So I think it's a masterpiece of filmmaking.
Well, we should mention then the director. It's Frank Pearson.
Yeah.
So he might not be a household name, but you'll have heard of some of the films he wrote. He wrote Cool Hand Luke.
Oh, God, right.
And he wrote Dog Day Afternoon.
Wow. Well,
yeah.
I mean, yeah, absolutely. That's a CV to die for right there.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think he got the Oscar for Dog Day Afternoon. And he also directed the 70s version of A Star is Born.
Another thing, Ollie, I was going to mention, talking about how the film was put together. When you watch it, you realize there is no score, right? There's no sort of added drama by having, a crescendo of strings in the background. None of that. So it is literally 15 men in a room. And the only music there is the final scene where I think it's Heydrich puts on, what is it, Haydn or something? Schubert, is it?
I was listening to it yesterday, actually. It's a beautiful.
Okay. And there's this wonderful, that scene itself is very telling, because I wrote down the quote. He says, he puts this Schubert on the gramophone, as they would have called it then. And he says to the assemble, it's only Muller, who's the head of Gestapo, and Heydrich are the only two left. and he says, this is a Schubert, whatever, and he says the adagio will tear your heart out, right? And which is a wonderful scene. And then Stanley Tucci Eichmann, calls it sort of what is sentimental Viennese shit or something like that. It's a wonderful, wonderful scene. But this is another crucial element. I said before how highly educated these people were in the main. There's a couple of exceptions, but generally 8 PhDs in a room of 15 people. But there's also this element, and Heydrich himself is that, right? His father ran the conservatoire in Halle an der Saale in central Germany. He grew up in a very, very cultured household. He played the violin to a really good level. So hence that comment. He used to play sort of violin duets with Admiral Canaris, for example, right? Who was in touch with the resistance and so on. But they had a curious, close relationship, the two of them, and they used to play these sort of duets, the violin duets together and things like that in their spare time. So he was a tremendously cultured individual, and yet he's hosting that meeting, he's doing what he's doing. So they get this aspect of the sort of cultured savage, right? Which is really quite complex. This is not, and this is where what I think in the broader sense, this is what sets the Holocaust apart from, for example, the mass killing in the Soviet Union by the NKVD, because this is genocide by a cultured people, backed by a sort of, a thoroughgoing philosophy, an idea that we're having to do this because it's for the good of mankind. And in contrast, you've got, the NKVD in the Soviet Union, generally the people doing the killing are peasant boys who are terrified of their superiors and are doing it because they're told to do it. Right. There is a philosophy there, absolutely. But there's still, the people at the sharp end are not, they don't have that sort of level of culture, if you like, that you do in Nazi Germany. So it's that I think sets it apart. And this is something that is a wonderful quote that always stays with me. Gollo Mann, who's a German writer and sort of popular historian from the I think immediate post-war period largely. But he had this wonderful quote where he talked about Nazi Germany as turning a nation of, I'm going to do it in German and then translate it because it works so beautifully in German. It turned a nation of, as he put it, Dichter und Denker into a nation of Richter und Henker. So there's a wonderful symmetry and rhythm about that. But Dichter und Denker is thinkers and poets. So it's turned a nation of thinkers and poets into a nation of judges and hangmen, right? And I think that sums up the sort of the sort of bizarre conundrum at the heart of Nazism, is that it took these people, as I said, 8 PhDs, most of them in law, in that room, and they are discussing the crime of the century in the coldest, most brutal terms. So that to me is the sort of fascination of what Nazism did to the German people. The metastasis that it represented was that it turned this hugely cultured nation into a nation of killers.
Yeah, I suppose a lot of the work in getting them to that stage had already been done in the 20s and 30s.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
All right, well, you mentioned categories, so we should probably start those. So
yes,
this is what we normally do, Roger. Tim and I, we pick our category. They're often named after a particular actor or film because...
Okay.
So I can't remember what order I sent them to you in. Have you got them? Are you looking at them?
I've got the first one I've got down is best scene.
Yes, right. Okay, best scene. So as you say, you could say the whole film.
Yeah.
But I actually was going to nominate that one at the end with the music, the Schubert, piece of Schubert, because it did show a contrast between Eichmann, who, for a start, he doesn't disagree with Heydrich. No. When Heydrich says, "Oh, it'll tear your heart out," Eichmann can say, "Well, actually, I find it Viennese shit."
I think it's Viennese shit. Yeah, no. Well, he would be a fool to contradict Heydrich, right? So he didn't do it. Yeah,
yeah. He's a very sort of, he's really Eichmann. I mean, I guess we'll get on to actor and supporting actor, but maybe we park Tucci's portrayal of Eichmann. But that scene was really good because there's another and not particularly nasty. Well, they're all nasty, but an especially nasty SS general with him, Heinrich Müller.
Muller was the head. His very shadowy character, played by Brendan Coyle, who, of course, later famous for Downton of all things, and it's quite strange. It's quite strange to see him playing such a sinister character. Muller's a really interesting character because he's so shadowy. He was head of the Gestapo by this point. Had gone up through the Munich police initially, joined the Nazi party, and that brought with it a senior rank in the SS, but he was head of the Gestapo basically. And in that film, I mean, he barely strings two sentences together. He's a very sort of dark, saturnine, silent character in the whole thing. And we don't know much about him, is the curious thing. He disappears at the end of the war. So he's one of those people, a bit like Bormann. All right, the Bormann story has been solved because they've identified him from DNA records when a body was found in the 1970s, since been identified. But for a long time, where was Bormann was a kind of a question, and where was Muller was a question as well, because he literally disappeared at the end of the war, never found, no proof of death, anything like that. So a really shadowy character. And I think actually that sort of very understated, the way he's portrayed by Brendan Coyle, actually works really well, because it brings out that sort of darkness in him, that he is someone that we don't know much about.
Yeah, he should be. I mean, if he's head of the Gestapo, he should be, one of the big names, like
absolutely,
like Bormann. And so is the implication being, because I always assumed, having read a few books, including Berlin at War by yourself,
of course,
and Berlin with the Russians advancing, that if you disappeared, basically you were killed somehow. You either killed yourself and they just didn't find the body. But is there an implication that in the case of Bormann and maybe with Muller, that they somehow found their ways to, I mean, obviously the Bormann one's been disproved, as you've just said, but the implication being that they ended up in South America?
I think that was, for a long time, was the assumption, as we know. I mean, Bormann's body was found, I think, in 1973, was later identified by DNA records, courtesy of his son. So that, the Bormann question is now cut and dried. We know that was Bormann. He was found not far from what is now the main railway station in Berlin, incidentally, very close to there. So he was last seen, I think, crossing the Weidendammer Bridge in central Berlin, in a firefight with the Russians, basically trying to escape. And actually where his body is found is only about a mile away from there to the west. So that makes sense that he's trying to get away from that particular conflict. So anyway, the Bormann question is solved. But Muller is still, to a large extent, I think, being wrestled over. I mean, there was a theory came out about 10 years ago, probably, that there was a body sort of disposed in a mass grave in a cemetery of sort of victims of the street fighting at the end of the war that supposedly was his. And I think the story came from whoever it was that was clearing the bodies, recognized that this was a high-ranking individual because of the uniform he was wearing, but he was dumped in a mass grave with everyone else. So that's kind of hearsay. It's not really, it won't stand up in court, obviously, but it's hearsay that Muller died, in the battle for Berlin, which is entirely logical, as you say, because it was chaotic and it was murderous, and nobody was counting the bodies or seeing who they were. So I think that's fair comment to assume that he didn't escape anywhere else. I think the numbers that actually did escape to South America are actually relatively small, and that tended to be used as a stick, particularly by the Russians. It was used as a stick with which to beat the Western Allies, to say, well, you're all complicit in allowing these bastards to escape, that's proven. There was a thing called Operation Myth, which all sort of bled into the mythology around Hitler's own death as well, where the Soviets were actively promoting the idea that Hitler had survived and escaped to South America along with various others, because it was a good stick with which to beat the West. It's the opening shots of the Cold War to a large extent.
Even though they had his skull
even though they had his skull, they knew very well that he'd not survived the bunker. They had what remained of his jaw, for example, identified by his dentist. I mean, all this is proven, is on record, and yet they still sort of beat the drum that the West had allowed him to escape, had facilitated his escape, and he was hiding with the sort of the quasi-fascist Argentinians at the time. So that was all a propaganda exercise.
Well, you say that though, but we mentioned Ian McNeice's portrayal of Gerhard Klopfer,
Mm.
and I mean, it's interesting. At the end, you get the credits. Well, just before the credits, you get the little info panel on each participant, and it explains what happened to them. A number survived the war, and
Yep.
Klopfer lives till 1987.
Yes, he's the last survivor of the participants. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's things like that I mean,
it is astonishing. I mean, that's the same year that Rudolf Hess died as well, of course.
Mm.
And I can remember very clearly hearing on the radio when Hess died, and I just thought, being astonished that he was still alive. It was like, oh my God, it's sort of a name from the distant past. Yeah, but like Klopfer, you say Hess died in 1987. Because I mean, before I sort of trigger a load of angry emails, of course, in terms of escapes to South America, Eichmann, of course, himself was one of those who benefited from the rat lines and all that. So I'm not at all saying that those networks didn't exist and that people didn't use them. I'm just saying that I think the scale of that and the number of prominent individuals that used it is sometimes exaggerated for propaganda purposes, and traditionally has been for that reason.
Yeah, so Klopfer became a tax advisor.
Yeah.
And when he died, his family issued a notice, I think, in the newspaper saying he had a fulfilled life that was to the benefit of all those who came under his sphere of influence.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Right. So back to best scene. So I mean, I think that classical music, because it does kind of show the Heydrich Eichmann dynamic. And as you say, the sort of cultured savage side of things.
Yes, that absolutely, I can go along with that. I do, as I mentioned before, that confrontation between Stuckert and Klopfer, if we can sort of isolate that and call it a scene, I think it's brilliantly acted as well, particularly Colin Firth, the way he portrays that sort of righteous rage at being accused of being a friend of the Jews is brilliant. He's brilliant there. And it actually, as a scene, in terms of the history as well, it does tell us a lot. I think it tells us about that legalistic nature, about the nature of anti-Semitism to a large extent. You've got that sort of the visceral anti-Semitism of the xenophobe, which is what Klopfer kind of represents. And then you've got the different sort of anti-Semitism of someone like Stuckert, which is much more, if you like, intellectual. He's saying, I hate these people because I understand how devious they are, and they're going to undermine us and they're going to find loopholes in the law. It's a sort of a different trait or a different aspect of anti-Semitism. So I think that particular scene brings a lot to the table, and it's a really dramatic scene as well.
Okay, let's go with that one then. That wins the Zapruder Award for best scene.
Right.
The Argo Award for most inaccurate. Which is it's difficult, but then they had to make up some of the. So I guess it could easily be the Schubert scene. Yes,
I mean that is obviously, well, we assume that's sort of invented, but it speaks to a deeper truth as well. As I said, that how cultured Heydrich actually was. That's a historical fact. I think where I know I'm trampling on your suggestions here, Ollie, a little bit.
You can do what you like. I'm
being Heydrich to your
Eichmann. That's
to your
nice.
Eichmann. I'm sorry about that. But I would say that the Kritzinger element that is as far as we can tell invented. So where they've got the scenes with Kritzinger, half-heartedly we have to say objecting, that seems to be pure invention. So to my mind, if we're gonna have an inaccurate scene, I think it probably has to be those that involve Kritzinger.
And I suppose the makers had to have an individual who had to put up some kind of, albeit half-hearted, struggle. Otherwise, it doesn't really work.
Otherwise, it doesn't work. There's no drama there.
Yeah. There's a very good the bit where Heydrich says to Kritzinger, "You would be a hard man to take down, but not impossible."
Yeah, wonderful.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Kenneth Branagh. Right. So that wins the Argo Award. Right. Simon Baker Award. Do you know who Simon Baker is?
I don't.
He's an Australian actor, and he gives a very good performance in the film Margin Call, all about the financial crash. So convincing that Aspects of History has named the Best Performance Award after him.
Brilliant. Well done.
Hope to get him on the podcast one day.
Yes.
We're huge fans. Right. So I think it's going to be very difficult to get. This is sort of lead role. This is going to be difficult to pick anyone else other than Kenneth Branagh for me.
Yeah, I have to agree. I mean, Branagh, that sort of that coldness that he brings to the role, which is utterly convincing as a portrayal of Heydrich. Of course, we don't know what Heydrich was like in person particularly much, but he's completely convincing as Heydrich. So both sort of, in terms of character and historically, as far as what we can know. So yeah, it's hard to see past Branagh for that one.
And I guess he does dominate. Is not really anyone else apart from maybe Stanley Tucci, who's in it as much as as
and Tucci is brilliant, by the way, as well. I mean, he really is. You mentioned it earlier on, the way in which he is very obviously subordinate to Heydrich and almost obsequious in that sense. And yet when he's dealing with his underlings, like when the waiter drops the tray of food, he says, clean this up, and he pays, report to me, and he pays. He's absolutely brutal downwards and obsequious upwards. So it actually shows you a lot of the real nature of that Nazi hierarchy. It was a brutal place.
Yeah, I was imagining being a waiter in the villa, because presumably you were a member of the working class.
Yeah.
You weren't necessarily a Nazi party member.
Presumably, I mean, you would have been, sort of security checked and so on, but they wouldn't necessarily, I wouldn't imagine, have even been SS men. They could very easily have just been, local staff. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so best supporting then it's Stanley Tucci. I think everything David Threlfall is in, he's brilliant.
Yes,
he plays Kritzinger.
Yes.
Colin Firth, of course.
Colin Firth, I think Stuttgart. I mean, obviously, if we're going to have Branagh in the best performance and then best supporting performance, the standout is probably Tucci in that sense. I would make a case for Stuttgart, for Colin Firth as Stuttgart, because again, I think the way he inhabits that character and brings those arguments that he makes, abhorrent though they are, the way he brings those arguments to the table and so effectively, I think that was really strong. But realistically, it's hard to see past Tucci in that role. I
do think Barnaby Kay was very good as Langer.
That was another one that Langer. Langer is the SD major who's been out in the Baltic, doing the mass shootings and so on. And this is, we mentioned it before we came on. There was an element in my head whenever I thought about conspiracy, because I saw it, a few times way back in the day, and I haven't seen it for ages until rewatching it this week. In my head, always, I had the Langer character, kind of chain smoking, which he is, but also, with the shakes and, showing all of those, all of the evidence of sort of mental strain because of what he's doing. And when I rewatched it, that was much less in evidence than I thought it was before. I still think he's, it's a very subtle performance. He's, as I said, he is chain smoking. He's very kind of agitated when he makes that interjection, when he says, I've been evacuating sort of 30,000 people to the east. Is this what you're talking about? So there's a sort of a controlled. He's almost like he's on the edge of a nervous breakdown, and I think that comes across really well. That absolutely, I think I had down on my sheet Langer, Tucci, and then Stuttgart as well, of course.
We're in perfect agreement.
We are.
It's interesting that they often mention the SS men. They often mention that they're soldiers and the honor of the soldier. But I guess they genuinely believed it, but they seem to just kill innocent civilians. I know they weren't innocent civilians in their view, but it's not like they were advancing, to identify a hilltop. They had to secure a bridgehead or something.
Yeah.
They're as Langer says, they're killing 30,000 men, women, and children, which he says women and children is actually a little bit difficult for the men to kill.
And it was absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's one of the drivers towards this, as we put it in inverted commas, more humane methods of killing, is to take the onus off, the emotional onus off ordinary soldiers. Now, you have to bear in mind the vast majority of those doing the killing. Now, Langer oversaw it, but he wasn't necessarily the one who was pulling the trigger. Those pulling the trigger could have been, as we said before, reserve policemen who weren't necessarily, the cutting edge in terms of ideological indoctrination and all the rest of it. They were, ordinary police reservists from Hamburg and from Berlin. So many of them even came from, left-wing backgrounds. They weren't even Nazis necessarily. So this, Christopher Browning wrote a brilliant book. I'm sure everyone knows it. Ordinary Men, Battalion 101. Which is a micro study of one particular battalion of these Einsatzgruppen, and he shows in that what motivates them isn't ideology, and the group that he uses are literally what I just described. They're reserve policemen. They're in their 40s. They all have wives and children, and they come from the sort of socialist suburbs of Hamburg. So this isn't your sort of hard-faced SS indoctrinated killer. This is people like you and me, Ollie. And the point is that it had a psychological effect, because those killers, it stayed with them, right? Not everyone is a psychopath. There's a higher proportion of psychopaths in society than we probably are comfortable with. That's a fact of life. But they're not enough for people to go and do that and be comfortable with it. So the vast majority of those doing the killing were, in inverted commas, ordinary Germans, and they self-medicated with beer. Some of them committed suicide. They used to go and get absolutely smashed with vodka afterwards, and this had an effect on their psychological state. And there's a wonderful scene, which is again very often retold in histories of the Holocaust, where Himmler goes to the graveside of one of these mass killings near Minsk, I think it was, and his long leather coat is splattered with somebody's brains, and he's nearly sick. He goes sort of milk white and is nearly sick. And afterwards, he's sort of sitting down having dinner with the commander of the Einsatzgruppe, and he says to him, "What are we doing? What are we doing with our young men?" He's concerned about the mental health and the moral. What's the word? The sort of
decay?
moral decay, the sort of steadfastness. How long can they keep doing this before they're utterly and irrevocably damaged by it? This is what he's thinking. So this is what leads to this idea of, more humane methods of killing. Humane for the killers, not the killed, right? So that, that's a really interesting aspect of it.
Okay. So best support, I think we're saying, are we saying Stanley Tucci, aren't we?
I think we are. Yeah. With honourable mentions for Colin Firth and, as you say, Barnaby Kay as Lange.
And in the trial of Eichmann, did he reveal any more about the Wannsee? I know he said he wasn't apologetic at all about the Holocaust. He regretted he couldn't have done more.
Yeah, I must say I'm not much of an expert on the Eichmann trial itself, but I think there are two different sides to him. So what he sort of curated, the image that he curated at his trial, is of a rather colourless bureaucrat, of a pen pusher, of someone who'd never killed anyone in his life, right? And this is where you got that phrase from Hannah Arendt about the banality of evil, because he sort of portrayed himself like he was a provincial accountant, and he looked like a provincial accountant, with apologies to all provincial accountants that are listening. But then there's a sort of private Eichmann. So there was a famous audio tape, an audio interview made with him by a sort of a Dutch fascist who also escaped to South America. And in that audio tape, which was not admissible evidence at the Eichmann trial, but that tape was made, in the 1950s. And in that, he's much more bloodthirsty. And there's this line where he says, he would cheerfully, jump in his grave in the knowledge that he'd helped to, eliminate however many million Jews it was. So that shows a much more bloodthirsty, much more brutally anti-Semitic Eichmann. So we have to be careful as to, that phrase, the banality of evil always gets trotted out. And there's something to it. But we have to be careful of applying that to someone like Eichmann, because we're then buying into that very carefully curated image that he presented at his trial, which is not really the real person. I mean, he was meticulous. There's a scene in the film. I'm sorry, I'm going on a bit. There's a wonderful scene in the film where he talks about going to have Hebrew lessons with a rabbi, right? But he did that, right? He was that meticulous that he wanted to go and learn Hebrew so he could understand his enemy better. right? So he did have Hebrew lessons. I think that scene, perhaps with the rabbi, and saying that these people are so stupid. Why did he go out on and get caught? Because didn't he know I would have saved him at least until the end of my lessons? That's one of the sort of those scenes that I had scribbled down here as a possible, because he tells that anecdote and it reveals a lot about the man as well. It reveals something from the historical record. So I think that's quite a sort of a profound scene.
It's amazing. All these actors, I mean, every single one of them, when they deliver their lines, you just believe they're so believable in their roles. There's not one, I think, who you watch and you think, I'm not sure about that. I don't know if it's a Shakespearean thing with, a lot of them, I think 14 of the 15 are British or Irish.
Yeah.
And so have a kind of,
with the exception of Tucci. Yeah.
Yes, and maybe come from a tradition of maybe speaking more lines without interruption.
Yeah,
but it's well done by all of them, really.
It is, and actually, I think your last category here I had on my list was legacy rating.
Yeah,
which I assume is sort of shorthand for being of historical value.
Well, yeah, it's partly that. It's the film even being remembered today because probably our highest power legacy rating is probably the most inaccurate historically we've done, which is JFK, and that caused the US Congress, I think, to set up a assassinations committee,
right?
So that's quite a powerful legacy.
Because it pushed the conspiracy idea.
Yeah, exactly. And yet, the first film we did in the film club was Lincoln, the Steven Spielberg film, which I don't think no one really mentions nowadays.
No,
which is interesting given it was made before probably all the culture wars started. Yeah. And so slavery being a big deal, I would have thought it would be raised a little bit more than it is.
Yes.
Anyway.
Yes, you're right.
So in that context, that's kind of but the historical side of things. We are speaking at some listeners might listen to another history podcast that is currently doing a Nazi series, and it is a very, very good Nazi series, brilliant Nazi series. Yeah. So actually, this episode is a very nice compliment.
It's a nice complementary contribution to that.
I was
going to say, by my interpretation of your legacy rating. Excuse me if I sort of bastardize it.
It's fine.
In terms of marrying. It's a very difficult thing to marry, historical accuracy with really good filmmaking, and so often, one or other gets lost in the wayside. I think this is a really good example of where that those two demanding mistresses, as it were, are both satisfied very well, because it really does help us to understand what the conference was. It helps us to understand, where it fits in the Holocaust. You've got all of the elements there that would have been discussed, that sort of tension between, those that want to, use the Jews for labor, for example, prior to or instead of exterminating them. Those opinions are expressed. That sort of curiously legalistic element that we talked about, expressed by Stuckert. You've got that sort of bizarre hierarchy within the Third Reich, the sort of bizarre competition for competence, which is inhabited by Heydrich. So there's so much going on there. And, Langer with that whole question of the morale amongst those who are at the sharp end doing the shooting. There's so much going on there that as a historical document, I think it works really, really well. It really does. And as we said before, it's almost a courtroom drama. Also, as filmmaking, works brilliantly well. So it's a rare thing that it actually ticks both of those boxes with aplomb.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Roger, this has been absolutely a tour de force. I've loved listening to everything you've been saying about it. It's actually wonderful. The film is brilliant. I sent you an email on Friday. I was watching it again. It's a particularly nasty film, I think. It just covers such horrific subject matter. But I would qualify
that, Ollie, if I may. I think it's kind of quietly nasty, because there's nothing explicit. Nothing ever kind of happens that you'd have to shield your eyes from. You wouldn't have to hide behind the sofa. The the
the language is
the wider context is horrific, and would make you want to hide behind the sofa. And that I think is a tribute to the genius of the filmmaking, because it takes the idea of the euphemism and all those euphemisms that were used in the conference itself. It takes that to another level, because it euphemizes, its content as well. Because it is sanitized to some extent, but brilliantly so. And I think it has a real tension because of that. I really, watching it again, tremendously impressed. The only thing I would say, the only thing of annoyance, is that it's not available on any of these sort of main platforms.
Yes.
Which I'm sure you're going to mention, but both of us had to go to the dark side to find a copy of it to watch. I don't know why this is, but it seems bizarre, because as I've said, I think it's one of the best films of the last 20 years.
Yeah, I will put links to a listener very kindly sent me a link to an app and a website that you can go to, where you type in the film and it tells you what platform it's on, and you can feed it to tell it what platforms you have. So I'll put that on there, and listeners can check that. They might have, I think Now TV might be available on Now TV,
Good.
which I think linked to Sky.
Right.
I'll link that in. Roger, that's been brilliant. You've articulated what the type of film is much better than I did. So thank you for that. And actually, I was thinking July 44 is the plot against Hitler.
It is indeed.
Is the Valkyrie film? Are you a thumbs up?
Yes. Shall we reconvene for that?
God, Roger, since you offered.
No, that'd be fun. Let's do that.
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, because I think that's actually not. I was watching that again because I went down a sort of Nazi
rabbit hole
films. Yeah, I watched Downfall as well.
Right.
And I thought I thought Valkyrie was pretty good, actually.
It is surprisingly good. I mean, we'll save our material for July, but it is surprisingly good. It's surprisingly close to the historical record, I think. Which, as I said, I was surprised as anyone when it came out. Yeah. Because when you see Tom Cruise, you don't think historically accurate, do you?
No, you don't. And we'll get to talk about Kenneth Branagh again.
Indeed.
So, Roger, thank you so much. Listeners, links are in the show notes for everything we've discussed, including Roger's books, his latest, The Forgers, which is excellent. I really recommend that.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ollie.
Thanks. Thanks so much for listening. Links are in the show notes. Plenty more history to come, and please do get in touch if you've got any questions or comments. In the meantime, thank you and good night.